Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Pan Future Society podcast. I am your host, Sean. As always, checked with management this morning. Still me. Yep. Anyway, today is Saturday, September 2nd, 2017. How about a quote to start the show this week? Future civilizations, better civilizations than this one, are going to judge all men by the extent to which they've been artists. You and I, if some future archaeologist finds our works miraculously preserved in some city dump, will be judged by the quality of our creations. Nothing else about us will matter. That's from Kurt Vonnegut, from Mother Night. I have to agree with him. I've spent most of my life as an artist of some kind or another, mostly as a musician, and that's what I'm leaving behind. For those of you who don't consider yourselves artists or musicians or participants in the arts in some way, what are you leaving? You can consider it art. In many ways, science is an art, and they are linked together. I was going to be deeply philosophical, but I got up a little earlier than normal today, and I think my brain is just not working yet. So ponder the quote, be an artist in everything that you do, and let's get to the news of the moment. All right, several news items I want to run by you this week. The Food and Drug Administration in the United States has approved a new cancer therapy that involves genetically modifying a patient's own immune cells. This is modified T cells that, through the modification, attack leukemia cells. And this is the first gene therapy that has actually been approved in the United States. This treatment is approved for children and adults up to age 25, specifically for those who have not responded to other therapies or who have relapsed. There's about 3,100 people a year under the age of 21 who are diagnosed with leukemia. And in the tests of this drug, 83% went into remission. So that's really cool. And this is a little gene therapy in action. Also on the news plate today, in the medical world, nanomachines drill holes into cancer cells. Sort of a little follow-up to our nanotechnology series from a couple of weeks ago. Some researchers have created nanomachines. They're just a nanometer wide. For perspective, 50,000 of them could be lined up across the width of a human hair. These nano drillers, as they call them, don't really look like machines at all, but they are molecules strung together and they run like an electric motor. A stationary stator holds the machine in place while a moving rotor spins and drills across the cell membrane. The paddle-like rotor, a series of 3 rings of carbon atoms, begin rotating 2 million to 3 million times per second when hit by ultraviolet light. Wow, that is really fast. On either sides of the stator are arms of carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen that stretch out to grip the surface of the cell. When they turn these things loose on some cancer cells in a dish, the holes formed within cells within a minute, and death of the cell soon followed. They can add molecules to the stator's arms that work as chemical selection. They call it sort of a zip code, so that these things only attack the cancer cells. Now, of course, as I mentioned, this was done in a petri dish. It's one of those things, so it's a ways off from being used in any human trials or anything like that, but just as proof of concept, I think this is amazing. And now,
it came from outer space.
Whoosh. Did you hear it? Yes, that was the sound of an asteroid passing nearby the Earth. Actually, just happened last night. I'm assuming September 1st would be yesterday, and that would be last night. This asteroid, known as Florence, Flo for short, I guess, named after the lady in the Progressive insurance commercials. No, not really. No. Asteroid Florence is actually a fairly large asteroid. It's about 2.7 miles or 4.4 kilometers in diameter, and it passed 4.4 million miles or 7 million kilometers near the Earth, which is astronomically speaking, is fairly close. What is also interesting about this asteroid and this event is that it's highly reflective. So in addition to its size, it's actually more reflective than the moon, whatever it's made out of. And judging by the reflectivity as it spins, it seems to be fairly round. So a lot of scientists are getting a good close look at this as it passes by. And actually, if you want to see it, somebody with moderately decent amateur astronomy skills should be able to see this. I think one of the articles I'm reading has links to Sky and Telescope magazine with charts to help you find it in space. So if you want to go see an asteroid with your own eyes, this one's a good candidate. Also in space news this week, Hubble spots first indications of water on TRAPPIST-1's planets. Back in February of 2017, astronomers from the European Southern Observatory announced the discovery of 7 rocky planets around nearby star TRAPPIST-1. That's a lot of planets, and also includes 3 planets which are within the habitable zone of that star. Now, as additional study has continued on this system, they have used the Hubble Space Telescope to make observations and are looking at how ultraviolet radiation interacts with a planet's atmosphere. By doing this, they can get a sense of the chemical composition of the atmosphere and decide what if there's maybe liquid water there, or what the atmosphere and the composition of the planet itself is made of. Somewhat long story short, they are looking at how much hydrogen has been lost out of the atmosphere of the planets, something they can use observing the interaction of ultraviolet light. And this suggests that the planets in the habitable zone and the outer planets of this system have not lost too much water. The inner planets are most likely dry and uninhabitable, but the ones in the habitable zone could still have a lot of atmosphere and a lot of water, and same for the outer ones, but they'd be a little too cold. So, very cool observations on some extrasolar planets. You know, if you're as old as I am, we used to not really even be certain that there were other planets out there. Now we're studying the compositions of their atmospheres and making very well educated guesses as to whether or not they have liquid water on their surfaces. This is incredible stuff. It really is. It really is a, to use a cliche, great time to be alive. And that's the news of the moment. On the main segment this week, back to Alvin Toffler and Future Shock. This week I want to cover in more detail the concepts from Alvin Toffler's book, in particular Future Shock, The Third Wave, and Power Shift. And I'll offer some thoughts on how his ideas can be generally applied to society and civilization, rather than talking about specific predictions. Toffler himself preferred not to make exact predictions. He considered it a fool's errand, although he used the term prediction more out of grammatical necessity. Some of the predictions he did make came true, and some did not. I'll link to a brief summary of a few specifics in the show notes. I think he had a knack for researching and writing about topics that were about to loom large in our lives, being just far ahead of the curve enough to seem prescient. But he can also be read in a general enough way to act as a guide or a tool of analysis for those of us who feel like we are in the middle of the future he outlined. It's very important to keep in mind the perspective of the times these books were written. Some ideas may seem obvious now, but remind yourself that Toffler was looking forward while we now look back. I also gave some more thought to the way Toffler seems like he's not as well known or as frequently referenced as other futurists are today. Though he died only in 2016, he doesn't come up as often as in websites and podcasts and blogs that are centered on futurism very much, not nearly as often as people like Ray Kurzweil do. He did receive praise from the likes of ultra-conservative politician Newt Gingrich, and many of Toffler's principles have been directed, through an organization he founded, to helping businesses, governments, and non-governmental organizations navigate the rapid changes we are experiencing. I wonder if this leads some, maybe from a more liberal slant, to dismiss his writings. I think it's a mistake not to separate the writing from other people's views of it, or to not separate the art from the artist. I also think this way about Ayn Rand. I disagree deeply with her politics and with those who hold her up as some sort of libertarian god, but I do not out of hand dismiss all of her writings or throw out my own interpretations of them. I think the same can be applied to Toffler. In retrospect, his work seems to be it's being applied to large organizations rather than individuals, but I think the individual can still get quite a bit out of it. In 1970's Future Shock, one of the main elements of the acceleration of life is in how situations are experienced. He uses the term situation as a catch-all term, meaning the various separate events that we all go through on a day-to-day basis. In this flow of experience, our increasing technology has increased the number of situations which we have in a day, and has also sped up or time compressed the duration of each of those experiences. We do not have the time anymore to digest things fully or stop and smell the roses, as one might say. I know in my own life I must consciously slow myself down and focus on each experience, as my day job and the social media around me tend to be a swarm of 5-minute events. I think this flood of information contributes to our tendency to just absorb sound bites, accept what confirms our biases, and automatically reject the things that don't fit our viewpoints. We feel like we no longer have the time for careful consideration of anything. He also talks about elements of a post-industrial society. We've developed so much production capacity that there is almost no scarcity in any manufacturing. Almost everything is disposable, and the cost of repair to many things far exceeds replacement cost. At one time, disposable lighters and disposable pens were revolutionary. Now, for many people, televisions, cell phones, microwaves, and even cars are disposable. Durability is no concern, and in some cases a liability, as the next version of a thing will become available almost as soon as the previous one hits the market. Of this he wrote, "People of the future may suffer not from an absence of choice, but a paralyzing surfeit of it. They may turn out to be victims of that peculiarly super-industrial dilemma, over choice." He also makes note that as a post-industrial society, we are shifting more and more of the manufacturing to automation and becoming more of a service-based economy. Now, keep in mind, he was writing this in the 1970s, and the service-based economy was basically all of the growth in the U.S. economy in the 90s and 2000s. What he, I think, did not see, at least not at the time of Future Shock, was that the service-based economy could also be handed over to automation. And even as early as Future Shock, Toffler began considering the future impact of things like cloning, global communication, and nanotechnology. All of this acceleration, he also predicted, would lead to people changing jobs and careers often, both because new opportunities arise and ways of doing things quickly become outdated. The third wave in 1980 examined further the social structures we live in and the changes they would face in the coming decades. By Toffler's definition, the first wave was the transition from hunter-gatherer groups to an agrarian society. The second wave came with the Industrial Revolution and mass production. The third wave begins in the 1950s with the transition in many parts of the world to a post-industrial society. All of these large-scale institutional changes also ripple out through society and change individuals and families, their structure, and how they fit themselves into the world. Also remember that hockey stick analogy from last week? Consider for a moment how much time we spent as hunter-gatherers, then as farmers, factory workers, and now as service workers. The acceleration is there also. What comes next? A society without jobs or money, and how soon? Consider this quote. Individuals need life structure. A life lacking in comprehensible structure is an aimless wreck. The absence of structure breeds breakdown. Structure provides the relatively fixed points of reference we need. That is why for many people, a job is crucial psychologically over and above the paycheck. By making clear demands on their time and energy, it provides an element of structure around which the rest of their lives can be organized. The absolute demands imposed on a parent by an infant, the responsibility to care for an invalid, the tight discipline demanded by membership in a church or in some countries a political party, all of these may also impose a simple structure on life. End quote. All of those structures are rapidly changing in the 21st century. Some of the principles of this third wave of society include, keep in mind, written in 1980, a change from the standard one-size-fits-all in industrial approaches to a more individualized one, not just in manufacturing, but also in media, education, and government. Changes to nation-states from, as he put it, above and below. From below being a loss of consensus, a divide between rural and urban, and conflict between fundamentalists and secularists or more liberal traditionalists. That sound familiar? From above, nation-states would feel pressure from large non-national groups like huge corporations, globally spread religions, criminal cartels, and terrorist groups. Also sounding familiar here. There would also be changes in large nations that split into smaller ones, and since 1980, we've seen events like the breakup of the Soviet Union, the splitting of Yugoslavia, and most recently, Brexit. At the same time, national economies are more and more tied to organizations like the WTO and treaties like NAFTA. Toffler thought that democracy would become less about occasional trips to the polling booth and more about direct interaction with leaders. The internet has made this possible, though its full and final effects are yet to be determined. In 1990's Power Shift, Knowledge, Wealth, and Violence at the Edge of the 21st Century, Toffler proposed that we were at the cusp of a major shift in power in the world. Power, by his definition, is the reciprocal of desire, or the ability to make people act as you want them to. For much of human history, violence, whether animalistic territoriality, feudal threats, or outright war and invasion, was the primary way a person or a group exerted power over others. Prior to the industrial age, even those with great wealth typically used violence or the threat of it to exert power. After the industrial age began, wealth and money in and of itself became a way to influence, sway, coerce, and convince people. In the 20th century, the radio, television, and computer made storage and transmission of knowledge and information easier than ever before, and the amount of information available also increased dramatically. The rise of the Internet has only ramped up this flood of knowledge at an exponential rate. Now, power is shifting away from the wealthy to those who can control the power of information. We are in the midst of this change right now, and at the moment are dealing with a conflict and imbalance, as those who control knowledge are using it to gain wealth and hold power. The potential equality of an information-based society has not yet fully arrived, and the use of violence is still a present threat. So, do Toffler's ideas explain recent events? If knowledge is now the biggest power, do those without education, without other means to gain wealth, lash out with violence? Do those who have power via wealth do everything they can, stir up anger at so-called elites, buy politicians, game the system in their favor to hold their power? And when knowledge, so widely distributed via the Internet, is the most valuable power, how do we deal with the effects? Is the "my feelings or opinion is just as good as your facts" sentiment stem from the distribution of power through information? There's no rule that says that the knowledge spread far and wide has to be true or valid or correct for people to use it. And there is a great danger here. The greatest conflict in this area right now are clearly between the wealthy, who are trying to hold on to power by pouring money into control and spread of information, sometimes against others who would use wealth in the same way, and sometimes against those who don't have a lot of money but can simply use the vast equality of the Internet. And of all the changes that have come in the past 60 years or so, have both freed people in their social lives and pushed those opposed into more fearful positions. Homosexuality is more accepted than ever, but those opposed, though fewer, are getting louder and more violent. We have passed through the era of civil rights laws, but have yet to change our culture. Again, perhaps there are fewer white supremacists than in the past, but those that remain are loud, sometimes violent, and just as able as the rest of us to disseminate the power of their information. Beyond the 3 books mentioned already, I would also recommend 2006's Revolutionary Wealth by Toffler and his wife Heidi, which acts as a follow-up to the Third Wave and somewhat also to Power Shift. Some elements of this book that expand on earlier ideas are a further discussion of cyberspace and social media and what might potentially replace a monetary-based economy. A few other thoughts to leave you with from Toffler's various writings. He wrote, "We shall also see many more family units consisting of a single unmarried adult and 1 or more children. Nor will all of these adults be women. As homosexuality becomes more socially acceptable, we may even begin to find families based on homosexual marriage." I think that came from Future Shock in 1970. And on the shifting of social expectations for child rearing, why not wait and buy your embryos later, after your work career is over? Thus, childlessness is likely to spread among young and middle-aged couples. Sexagenarians who raise infants may be far more common. I just heard an NPR report a few days ago about the rising age average that people have their first child. It's for the first time is over 30 for men. I'm not sure we'll ever commonly see 60-year-olds raising kids, but the age of parents certainly is rising. Toffler also coined the term prosumer, meaning producer and consumer. He predicted ever more do-it-yourself production in every aspect of life. This is perhaps one of his most profound predictions, although its effects are often in the background. From music and art to fan films on YouTube, Kickstarter projects, and home 3D printing, the production of nearly everything has become decentralized. Given the state of the world today, I think it's as good a time as any to reread Toffler. If there is only one thing that you take away from his writing, I think it should be to always consider the individual, social, and societal impacts of technology, accelerating change, and shifts in our large-scale organizations, and not just leave it at the wow factor of some new gadget. All right, that's your show. Wow, that was a long one. Lots to digest there, and frankly, I could probably do many, many more shows on Toffler's writings, and I probably will on some of those particular topics. But thank you for joining me. Thank you for sticking through the show. If you are a Patreon supporter, thank you. And this is the new month here, the first round of perks for the Patreon supporters will be going out. If you are just getting the newsletter, it will be posted today. And if you're at one of the higher tiers and you're getting some stuff, your stuff is in the mail. And thank you again for doing that. If you would like to support the show via Patreon, go to patreon.com/Sean Gill. That's SEANGILL. Or just go to the website panfuture.org, and there's links to everything there. You can find the Patreon, the YouTube page, the Twitter, all the other stuff, the blog. I did a new blog this week, did a book review. Check that out, and go to the podcast page for all the show notes and links to the information about things that were covered today. All right, that's what I got. Everything is going to melt here next week because we're having yet another heat wave, but I hope it's better wherever you are, and have a good week. I will talk to you again in the future.